lectures on inequality. They start with information inequality, and then to peer pressures in education, how they can lead to inequality. And while people are gathering, let me just introduce myself. I'm Ruben Enikolopov. I'm a professor and rector of the New Economic School. And I'll start with this with the first lecture will be information inequality, partly because it's like one very close to what my own most of my own research on, which is a lot of it is focused on mass media. And the reason why I think this is extremely important, why information media is so relevant for topics of inequality, is that basically the information always was a very important, actually, kind of a resource. Knowledge is like the famous saying that knowledge is power was relevant for basically for centuries, and it was invented like 400 years ago. But now, with the change in technology and changing in the economy that we live in, access to information becomes actually like one of the crucial things. And when we talk about the outcomes of the people and what in terms of their welfare, etc., we should worry about the inequality in access to information as much as we worry about access and initial wealth. For example, how parental upbringing affects your future outcomes. Here, I mean, I will not, for now in this lecture, I will not talk about information that we get through education, which is clearly one of the most relevant and maybe one of the main drivers for the quality of the education that we get. I will be talking more today about the information that, so suppose you're already educated, you're working, you're like already a functioning individual, you need to get information about what really goes on in the world. Where do you get this information that you like, more like, short-term information? Here the information can be provided in two main ways. If we think about it, like how we get information is that basically kind of more centralized way, which is usually like one of the main channels for which we get a lot of us get the same information at the same time, is mass media. Just all basically by definition, that is of what is mass media is means of delivering information to large masses of people. And the second way is a decentralized way. It's more what you get from friends, from relatives, through word of mouth, through rumors, etc. And clearly, it's extremely important how to interact, because basically all the information delivered in centralized way, you get something, you hear something on radio, you hear something on TV, and then you discuss it with your friends. And how you interpret the same pieces of information can very much depend on your personal network and how you discuss what you've seen on TV, heard on the radio, among your friends. So that was a standard way we can classify information like previously. Currently, actually, with the advanced technologies, these two things become way more intermixed, because we'll talk about in this particular lecture about social media. Social media is really like a game changer in that sense, since it basically means that the centralized and decentralized way, they get intermixed. In the same platform, you'll get news, and at the same time you discuss them and you share them, etc. So the line between centralized and decentralized ways becomes blurred much more than it used to be. But still, I mean, the bottom line is that if we think about the macro level phenomena, if we think really about the inequality at the global level, we mostly care about not particularities of your network of information, what you get from your relative, but more like of information available to everyone and how diverse is this information. So basically, are interested in mass media and more recently social media as means through that affect the distribution of information in society, which can potentially have important implications for the distribution of information in society and the way this information is used by different individuals and how in the end it affects the distribution of more more tangible outcomes such as income, etc., public goods, for example. And in that sense, the mass media as a way of affecting this of providing information at the macro level becomes extremely important for these topics. So that is like why the study of mass media is so important. So now that I think that hopefully everyone is back from the break, I just like organization point is like feel free to interrupt. I'm very much open to the questions. So if you want to ask a question, just straight like virtually raise a hand. I should see it. If I don't see it and don't notice it, just like feel free to jump in and ask questions, or you can ask them in the chat, which is also available. So feel free to interrupt me and ask questions at any point in time. So meanwhile, we think about again the power of mass media. It's actually kind of like the interesting thing historically was that it was actually kind of understudied a lot in academic literature for a while, although in practical terms by all the politicians, it has been noted as, for example, by Malcolm X, that media is extremely important and very influential and affects societies to a great extent, including in the promotion of policies that directly affect inequality. And so before we move on like to how it affects, like just to be clear, how can media affect information? And that is interesting that because it's we have to understand that the way economists were thinking about mass media is also evolving in last years, because in the initial stage, the economists was always analyzing media and the way it affects behavior only through the fact that just provision of information. That basically you can there are pieces of evidence that you get from mass media. You use whatever like Bayesian updating, using your priors about particular important issues. You update it based on information you get from mass media, and then you act upon it. And then the main role of the media is what is being said on a particular issue, because they can provide information that they can deliberately withhold information, for example, and that affects actions. So now, especially with advances in behavioral economics and better understanding of psychology of people and how people process information, we understand that actually, at least not as important, are things like agenda setting and priming. Is what matters is not only what you are saying about particular issue, but which issues you are actually covering in a newspaper. So, for example, if you will be talking a lot in mass media about inequality, no matter what you say about inequality, people will start thinking more about inequality and thinking that inequality is an important issue. And that translates actually into kind of many other dimensions, how much mass media writes about particular topics. Basically, based on this, people also update how important these particular issues are for real world outcomes. And that by now, there's plenty of evidence that this channel is also extremely important. So it's not only what you're writing about the topics, but which topics you're writing about is also extremely important. And then the framing also plays a role, that even like the words that you're using, describing exactly the same facts, seriously affect how people interpret that. So the same numbers of for example, like unemployment can be, depending on the political stance of a particular newspaper, can be interpreted as a huge gain in unemployment, and you can say, well, the unemployment decreased by whatever 5%, of the biggest decrease in the past whatever 20 years. That if you want to stress this, if you are if you want to stress that employment is very high, you will say, well, yes, employment decreased, but it's still at the highest historical level. You'll be using exactly the same numbers, talking about exactly the same topic, but the interpretation by different people will be very different. So, and now, we better understand that actually mass media is important on the way it affects people on all three dimensions. Which facts that provide on a particular topic, what topics it writes about, and how it frames exactly the same information on exactly the same topics. Everything plays a role. So why, and coming basically, I think it's a historical diversion, that basically why from so many years people, at least in academic world, were kind of not paying sufficient attention to mass media. And that basically started because of the first results or the first important papers that were written about this. Because people were became interested in mass media only during and after World War II, just because it was the first very observable use of mass propaganda, predominantly by the Nazi regime in Germany, but also is counteracted by Allied forces as well. So at first it was in practice, people saw this happening, and usually academic theory, at least in social science, it kind of lags and follows real world outcomes rather than precedes them. So first there's something important happens in the real world, like use of mass propaganda or financial crisis, etc. And then social scientists rush to study this phenomenon. So that's exactly happening with the mass media. So the radio appeared as a new technology, and then it started being used, and to a large extent, for example, by Nazi regime. Then people started studying this, and the first findings were interpreted as in what was for many years then called minimal effect paradigm. So using primarily studying the effect of newspaper article, very famous people like Paul Laderfeld, who was basically one of the people who started empirical sociology. So it's not some no names. There was really the top-notch academics. They came to the conclusion that media the only thing that media do is to reinforce this existing beliefs and predispositions. It can never persuade you in almost anything. And basically, these were the findings that were adopted as a consensus in literature in the end of 40s and beginning of 50s, and then for basically almost half a century, that was the paradigm that mass media is not that important because it can only, yes, it can polarize, for example, society even more by persuading people into things that they already believe in, but that doesn't really persuade people to act or believe in something that they haven't believed in to start with. And the main problem with that was actually kind of methodological. So that all these studies, they're doing the best that they could by using the methods that were available in the 40s and 50s. But then in studying mass media, it turned out that these limitations turned out to be extremely important, because what they couldn't solve is the issue of self-selection. And meaning, mostly meaning that people choose media that reflects their preferences and prior beliefs. What in behavioral economics and sociology, psychological literature, that corresponds to what is usually called confirmation bias. People really like to hear information that coincides with their prior beliefs, so that I always thought like this, and now I find factual information that corroborates that I was always right. And they really hate to listen to anything that that puts into doubt what the beliefs that they already have. So people choose news sources that confirm their prior beliefs, and as a result, if you just look empirically what people consume, what type of mass media they consume, and how changes their belief, you really don't see much of an effect, because people only corroborate their own belief if they just allow them to choose mass media freely. And as a result, if you do not control for self-selection, you don't find much of an effect. So big to get away with this problem, you need to have some source of exogenous variation to identify the fact that people, so that people read media, some sources of mass media, not because they chose to, but because of some whatever exogenous or quasi-exogenous reasons. So one of the ways to get around this is kind of the standard, whatever. Some people think it's a gold standard, some people doubt it, but one of the really like scientific, one of the most advanced methods to studies is experiments. So they, if you want to see the causal effect of mass media affecting something, you just can make an experiment in which people randomly get some exposed to some mass media or not. We're talking like, so make it realistic. It's not that you put people, like people also do it in the lab, when you're forced to sit and watch some TV show, and other people in different group watch some different show. That's kind of, these studies, they're very clean in terms of internal validity. They have some doubts whether people kind of will actually, you can extrapolate this to real world, because in real life, people don't do it. You don't force anyone to listen to radio, to watch TV, etc. So what people actually do in real life, if we want to do this, is, for example, what was done in a field experiment by Gerber, Caroline, and Bergen, was basically you randomly give free subscription, for example, to a particular newspaper to different people. So you don't force them to read these newspapers, but you really encourage them. If there's a free subscription, it's delivered to your door, like it really increases the chances that you will start reading this newspaper. And basically what they did, but particularly this study, they just delivered subscription to Washington Post or Washington Times. And one is this is like, and it was done in Washington area, in Washington DC area. And clearly, like, I mean, the interpretation is pretty straightforward. One of this is a left-wing, more pro-democratic newspaper. Another is more right-wing leaning, more Republican supporting newspaper. And then you see whether there's actually any change in the voting behavior of the people. Whether it's true that after reading a more pro-democratic newspaper, they start voting more democratic, and the other way around. And what they actually found is that it was indeed true that in the gubernatorial elections, people who were receiving more pro-democratic newspaper, they're more likely to support Democratic candidates. So basically, just quasi-random exposure that experimenters provided you with a free subscription to this newspaper changed your voting behavior, which can obviously change. If you change voting behavior and change people who get elected, that can have very profound effect on outcomes. But that is kind of, these field experiments, again, they are gold standards, but really they're hard to implement. It's like really hard to find settings in which with mass media you can do it. So people actually use some other technologies, other tricks to get at the causal effect of mass media. And again, one of the most kind of standard ways is always in economics. For instance, we always in economics are concerned exactly about causal effects, is finding what is called quasi-exogenous variation. Is that some people, so basically you need to find a situation in which some people get get exposure to some mass media, for example, radio, TV, not because they chose so, but because for some forces beyond their control, they have this opportunity or not. So basically, in case of radio, TV, etc., what you try to find is some technological constraints that make it easier or harder to get access to particular radio station, TV station, or internet technology, etc. So in terms of when we're talking about most standard traditional media, which is radio or TV, you exploit the fact that most of it, for most, like at least for the history of the creation of this technology, most of the time it was transmitted by radio waves. So both TV and radio, the broadcast of TV and radio, that transmitted by waves. So basically, some really kind of physical constraints on the signal propagation, where exactly your transmitters are located, where exactly your receivers are located, where it affects where you can listen to a particular radio station or not. So if you have a transmitter, you're sitting in your home and there is a hill between you and the transmitter, you will not be able to hear this radio station or receive this TV channel. Whereas maybe like your neighbor, which can be basically like half a kilometer on the side, but is not covered by this hill, will be able to listen to this radio station or listen to this TV or watch this TV channel. So this is like the main idea that is used in many papers to exploit these physical characteristics of signal propagation coupled with like geographical particularities, particular region, to find instances which you have regions that have better or worse reception, signal reception of radio, TV, etc., but otherwise they're very similar. So in the sense that you take two regions that are very similar on observable characteristics, nothing is different, except one has a better reception of radio, another has, for example, radio. Another has worse reception, and then you know that in the first region there will be more people listening to this radio than in another region. Even when we have bad reception, people who are really committed can find ways to listen to it, but the proportion of these people will be lower. So basically, it's a kind of quasi-exogenous instrument. It works pretty well, and people use these instrumental variable techniques to use this radios or TV signal strength as an instrument for actual listenership. And there are plenty of papers now that use it, including like some of that I wrote to the co-authors based on radio and TV in very wide, and people use it in very wide range of cases, starting from radio in US in 1920s, like TV in Indonesia in the 90s, and we started it in Russia in the 90s, in Nazi Germany in the 30s. The same technique can be applied in many different instances, and in all these cases, you find the very important implications that on the behavior of people, that the information that they get from mass media really seriously affects how people behave. And more recently, people show the same kind of ideas for propagation, not of the radio and TV, but internet, because by now, most people receive internet not by like 10, 15 years ago. Mostly it was broadband for cables or whatever. You have to connect to your computer. Now most of the people receive internet through 3G. At least if you look at the share of the world population, mostly 3G. So you can use, for example, the technologically how 3G technology spreads to get the information on the behavior of people. And there are already these new papers by Dante Donati, Simon Accord, and Jurowska that look at the effect of the internet spread through 3G on the behavior of people, with finding the same thing. They really have a serious effect on how people behave. So, but that basically, methodologically, this is like another, like if not experiments, the second approach use these technological constraints on radio propagation of waves and features of geography to get at this quasi-exogenous variation. And methodologically, before moving to substantial findings, the third method is find something else. That's usually worse. Like, if you can find technological, you have to find some smart way of some tricks, what happened, why this particular TV station or whatever was spreading faster here than there. So one very famous paper, for example, in cable industry, was that the effect of Fox News by Delavigne and Kaplan was showing that the effect of Fox News, which now is a big thing, everyone knows that it's very important, and now it's really hard to actually to study Fox News. All the people still find some tricks because everyone can basically can watch Fox News. If you look 20 years ago, that was not the case. Based on particularities of cable industry, in some areas of US, you already could get Fox News, and in some areas you could not yet get it. And by comparing this, and that was really by not related to these places being more Republican, more Democratic. It was basically at the time of the of Fox News trying to enter your market, whether you had a free cable channel available or not. And that's it. So that was pretty random. And then by comparing areas where you already had Fox News with areas where you did not yet had a Fox News, you can see the effect. And then you already, 20 years ago, you already saw that having access to Fox News, like nobody forcing you to watch it, you just have it in your cable. One of the cable TVs already led to an increase in support of Republican candidates, especially in Congress. So that Fox News already was playing a role, but then you can already have, there was a trick. You need to know something about cable TV. For example, so there are several examples here if you want to use it. For example, what we use in our paper in which we study social attack of social network spread, you use some quasi-exogenous variation in from which cities the first users of social media were coming, and then you know that in these cities, this social media then will be spreading faster because of the network effects. That usually, the more people you know that are already using the social media, then more likely you are to use it. So if there are already more people in your city using this network, there will be more people, even more and more people in the city using the social network will be spreading faster in these places. So you use this kind of small variations to get at this quasi-exogenous variation. So that was like methodologically how, in principle, you can study the effects of mass media. So if you have any questions on more like methodological part, please ask them now. Any questions? Don't hesitate.
Hi, I have a question. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Going back to the RCT with the 2 newspapers in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
So I'm still not clear because that was in 2009, right? You said, I think it was from 2000.
The paper of 2009.
A bit earlier.
The actual experiment was a bit earlier.
But the RCT was earlier.
It takes a while to publish a paper in economics.
Right. No. I was just wondering. I mean, even let's say 15 years ago, I think the political landscape of the U.S. was pretty polarized, right? And so it is not clear to me the exogenous variation in terms of offering free subscription, whereas we can assume, I mean, I would assume that people in DC would have an equal access to the 2 newspapers, and the only thing preventing them would be maybe income constraints, let's say, if they don't have enough money to subscribe. But still, if the society is so polarized, what is it that because I can imagine that some people, even if they don't have income constraint, and even if you give them left-leaning newspapers to read for free, they would still elect not to do so. So I'm not clear how that would really resolve this issue of self-selection in the end.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I see that in the chat there's a question that is very similar to that. So that's a very important methodological question. That is actually a result of a lot of experiments. So in experiments, this is a kind of encouragement design, what it's called. So it's intention to treat. So you kind of push people in the direction that you want. It can be read this newspaper or take this pill or whatever. Because if you can randomly prescribe people to take a pill or whatever, get vaccinated. If they're really against it, they will find a way to cheat it and not like pretend that they did it and never did it if they really don't want to. Or if they really want to, and you don't give it, they will find like a way to smuggle it and to take it in this pill, whatever, get vaccinated. So it is very important like that. It's actually obviously it's true. Like if we randomly subscribe people to one newspaper or another, it's not that 100% of people who are subscribed who get this free subscription change their behavior because you just provided them. So because for two reasons. One is that you mentioned like maybe already subscribed to this paper, like if really wanted to this, so that doesn't affect their behavior. Second, if they really don't want to read it, they will like whatever. If you just drop it to your doorstep, it will be lying there. They will never open. First of all, you need to measure. That's a very important example. So in this experiment, they actually measured this through two ways. First, they actually made a survey of people whether they read this
I see.
They read it, and they asked questions that basically kind of like if you read it, you would answer it. If you haven't read it, you probably wouldn't answer it. But that was kind of more subjective. Still, kind of there's a reporting bias. You can say, obviously I read it. So they had a second way, well, less, a bit more noisy, but it's like it's US specific because they're like it's a suburban areas where you literally drop newspapers on the doorsteps, and then basically they hired research assistants, whatever, who are observing what people do with this newspaper. Do they actually open them, or they kind of piled around, or they like drop them immediately? So that was the first step. But then, so basically you can get information about who actually read newspapers or not. What is important, and this is a very important limitation of instrumental variable approach in principle, in which there's no and it applies to experiments where there's no full compliance. You will be able to identify the effect only for people who change their behavior because of this experimental intervention. So it's only people who started reading this newspaper just because you gave them free subscription that will be driving the result. Right. So this is kind of formal. This is called local average treatment effect. Mm-hmm. Local means that it's only for people who reacted this. And then it's up to you, like the researcher, to interpret who are these people. So clearly, like die-hard Republicans will not be affected by a free subscription to a democratic newspaper just because, well, first they will never open it, they will throw it away immediately.
I mean, I was wondering, maybe it would have been easier to select the sample frame, let's say, from the voting records or registration, so only targeting independents, for example, rather than diehard Republicans or diehard Democrats. But that's another issue.
But I think that depends on your question. Actually, because if you want to maximize the effect of newspaper, if you really if your goal is your want to change people's behavior, then yes, you'll try to identify the group that is most kind of persuadable and targeted. Here, you're a researcher. You want to study basically the effect. What if we suddenly increase and make much easier access to the pro-democratic newspaper? What will be the effect? And the effect will be driven by loosely three groups of people. First, there will be Republicans who will ignore it. Then there'll be diehard Democrats that already they don't need to persuade them. They already. And then there'll be independents who can change their behavior because or the access to this new media. And then if you just do this experiment, just magnitude of the effect will take into account also the proportion of these people. So that if I give randomly newspapers, the effect is like this. It can be for different reasons. This fact, for example, the effect is small. Why? It can be for two different reasons. First, it may be the case that the society is so polarized that there are almost no independence. And independence, yes, they are persuaded by the newspaper. They're just like this share of independence is minuscule. Or the second interpretation is that just the newspaper is not persuasive. Even independents do not react to it. So in the end, what is important is experiments. Actually, you can estimate two things. One, what is called intention to treat effect, is this that you did like just compare treatment and control groups. We gave you newspapers, we didn't give you a newspaper free subscription. What's the effect? And it takes into account both of these mechanisms. And then it answers the question, what if we provide newspapers? Second is this IV estimate, which says that for those people who read newspaper in the end, what share of them that changed their behavior? And that answers only the question, the more specific question, how persuasive is the newspaper for those who read it, which basically means independence. And these are both very valid questions. They are very different just because of these two mechanisms. So yeah, this is a great question. They're saying like experiments, they look so simple. It's treatment control. Once you start interpreting that seriously, it becomes way less obvious, and you have to take this consideration into account. So thanks, that was a great question.
Thank
you. Yeah, so that's a good in the chat. There's a good good note that the setting was actually in Washington Post, Washington Times was particularly good because these are not extremely left wing and right wing. It's not like watching Fox News or MSNBC. It's not like really people will not watch it if they belong to different political camps. They're kind of left wing leaning or right wing leaning, but still more or less centrist. So actually, there the take up and the number of people who actually read them was not that small, because you could expect these numbers to be really small if in a very polarized setting with a very extreme newspapers. So that's a really good point. Okay, any other questions, methodological? Okay. There's one question in chat. But lab studies, yes, there are a lot of lab studies as well. They're more less done by economists. They're more done by people in communications studies. Iyengar is like a guru of lab experiments on mass media, especially they has like a lot of papers on using advertising campaigns, especially for presidential advertising campaigns, trying to get at this. But really, mass media, by now, like my interpretation of what's going on now in this literature is that exactly because, as you mentioned, there are a lot of possible channels, etc. Most of these channels are very context dependent and kind of driven by context in which people interact with this media. That's why the lab experiments are not that popular in this area of studies, just because people try to smart things to disentangle different channels, but in the lab it seems like people kill yes, it's great in terms of internal validity, you control for a lot of things, but the price is that you kill a lot of context. People don't usually consume TV channels or read newspapers in a closed environment where you're fully controlled and there's an experimental watching you. Like, how do you look me in the eyes and tell me how you what you think about this political advertising campaign? It's just like so different that people think that context is very important. First, that's why lab experiments are very kind of, I think, now not that popular, although as I say, this experiment by Iyengar, they're really great. Second, what I think is also at least as important, as I mentioned, is that the interaction between getting news from mass media and this network effects, talking with your neighbors, etc., means that there, what is in economics called, there can be potential general equilibrium effect. So basically, it's a big difference if I know that I'm the only one who receives this news or reads this newspaper or watches this political advertising, and it's a very different thing if I know that I'm reading newspapers and everyone, like all the subscribers, are getting the same information. So this is like what common signal means, etc. So suppose we're talking about whatever, a scandal, like whatever, Watergate. One thing is if I'm privately getting a letter telling you, there was like some weird things going on, the president of the US is implicated. And another thing is if I'm reading it in the most popular newspaper, at least one of the most popular newspapers, and I know that not only I know this, but millions of people also know it. In real life and political kind of setting, especially, this common knowledge is extremely important feature of the mass media. When we talk about political actions, what I think that other people think, what I know, what other people know, plays a huge role. So in game theory, this is a really like a concept of common knowledge, and it's a very important feature of mass media, and it can change a lot of things. So, and that is in the lab, you cannot do it. So that's why I think like field experiments are way more popular, or like observational natural experiments are the main driving force in studies of mass media from methodological point of view. But yeah, if you're interested, I will write in the chat I hope I'm not misspelling his last name. This guru of lab experiments. So like he has basically a lab that produces as a small factory of papers that use lab experiments for especially like political advertising campaigns. Okay, so then let's look at more like substantially. So one paper that I wanted to talk about, like what and through which channels mass media can actually lead to results that are relevant for inequality issues, is this absolutely great paper by David Stromberg and Jim Snyder. And David Stromberg from Stockholm, he's basically one of the first people who actually changed the tide and provided the first papers that credibly estimated causal effects of mass media and showed that they're important. And then it would happen like 15 years ago. And then there was like a change in the tide in this academic literature. And after 2 or 3 papers, people started people completely changed their point, as usual happens with people. They completely changed their point of view to the opposite. And now everyone tells that mass media is one of the most important things. It's like this as important as it's like 4th branch of government, as important as judges, legislature, and presidents. So now everyone is completely persuaded that mass media is extremely important. So David Stromberg was one of the people who changed it from being irrelevant to being one of the most important things in political life. And this is actually a great paper, because I think that in one picture it shows all the mechanisms that are important, and also it uses a very nice and interesting kind of way to identifying things. So basically the question is, if I start writing more, providing more information about your congressman, just in the newspaper, start writing more about this person, how does it change the information available to voters, the behavior of the congressman itself, and the policies that are perceived that this congressman pushes? And so the important thing is to get some variation, like newspapers are writing more or less about particular congressman. If you just look at it and compare observationally, there's content that they write a lot about this person or not, obviously this will be a wrong conclusion, because usually, the more active, more interesting, more star congressman, these are the people about whom the newspapers write a lot, and they behave differently. So there's no doubt. So you want to have some quasi-exhaustive variation why people, while newspapers write more or less about particular congressmen. And here, what is important, so this is studied in the context of the US. What is important is that in the US, most of the newspapers, at least like we're now studying the period of like 90s, 80s, dated period. What was happening, what is important is that most of the newspapers, they have a pretty well-defined geographical area in which they're being sold. So this is basically, you know, that the area, the region, and it's not like it doesn't necessarily coincide with administered division by state, county, etc. It's just like there's a special agency that collects this information. It's important for advertisers mostly. The information is collected for advertisers only because if you want to sell advertisement, you really want to know where this newspaper is being sold, because this is the area that they're targeting. And so they know where the region in which this newspaper is sold, and then you can see how it coincides with congressional district. And then, like, to put it to extreme, there can be two different extreme cases. Suppose first that this is the area in which, sorry for my lousy picturing skills. This is the area in which the newspaper is sold. So suppose now that the congressional district is exactly this area. So in this case, you know that you are editor of the newspaper. You know that all the audience of your newspaper is from the same congressional district. So they all have the same congressman in the House. They're all interested in the behavior of this person. So you'll be writing a lot about this person. Consider it like that. So to understand the difference, like suppose there is a different setting in which this area in which your newspaper is sold is on the border of 4 different congressional districts area. So you know that among your readership, like quarter of them care about one congressman, quarter about another one, quarter so it's 1/4 each. So if you write about each congressman, only 1/4 of your readers will care about this person. So you basically, what in the end happens, you don't write a lot about congressmen at all, just because your audience is not like, it so happens that they're all interested in different congressmen. You cannot write about 4 different congressmen. It's too much. There are constraints on the amount of whatever pages you have. So in the end, this is exactly what they do as a source of exogenous variation. So they construct this measure, which they call congruence, is that how much your readership area coincides with the congressional districts area. So in my example, what I wrote, try to draw right here, it will be a low congruence. They don't coincide well. And what I tried to draw in the first case, when they exactly coincide, is a perfect congruence. It's like 100% congruence. So then, once you construct these measures, you can actually already try to see whether this hypothesis that they will be writing more if Congress is higher is actually valid. So this is the first picture. So if you so here this is basically this measure of Congress, just not scaled. So it's from 0, not from 0 to 100, but from 1 to 1. Here and here, you just look at the number of articles about congressmen that they publish, and you see that the more congruent are, the more media districts coincide with congressional districts, the more they write about congressmen. It's really true that how this overlap between congressional districts and media area works out affects how much they write. And you can treat it basically almost as a quasi-exogenous, especially because they also at some point they look at the congressional redistricting and see the same newspapers, how they change their behavior after redrawing the borders of congressmen, and exactly the same thing happens. So this comes as basically the quasi-exogenous variation in how much you write about newspaper, about congressmen because of this Congress. And then you can see how this affects. So basically what you see is that this overlap affects the behavior of newspapers. They write more or less about congressmen. Then you want to see how it affects the behavior of voters and the information that's available. So then you go to surveys and ask them, for example, how much news they read about the congressman, because maybe they're not interested in newspapers published, they don't read. No, well, thank God there's some correlation. So the more Congress, again, you have, the more readers read stories about the congressman and in general about politics. Moreover, they have the more these districts coincide, the more correct information readers have. I mean, the standards are low, so the main questions are: what is the name of your congressman, for example? Whether you get the right or wrong answer, something like this, like factual information, you can check, and actually readers do have more correct information if newspapers write more about it. What is more important is that people vote in elections also more if they have more information. That's again, that goes to some theories in political economy, which basically says that the more informed you are, the more likely you'll go to vote. If you don't know anything about your congressman and other candidates, you just don't go to vote. A lot of people behave. It's pretty rational actually to do this. So the turnout goes up if you have more information available through mass media about Congress. So voters behave different. So the next question, does it affect the way politicians behave? Do they, if voters get more information about them, if you're in political economy and theories of accountability, that should force politicians to try to work more, because, well, you're being watched, you have to work. If voters don't get information about your behavior in Congress, you can shirk, you can do whatever. Nobody will notice. Well, no, here people are watching you because newspapers are writing about it. So what happens is actually you see that the behavior of politicians is also different. First, they make more witness appearances in the committees. So basically, they work more. They do something. It's another question how useful it is, but they do something. They go and try to push different laws. But what is probably more important, their party loyalty goes down with with the increased information about newspapers, which basically means that, and in general, you can think about congressmen, like they can, when they're deciding how to vote, they can either follow the party line blindly and vote how their party wants them just because they get some perks from the party, or they can pay attention to their constituency and vote how their voters vote. And the more they pay attention to voters, the more likely are the situations in which these preferences do not coincide with the party line. So you have to violate the party line and vote differently from your party. So this is kind of the interpretation of this decrease in party loyalty, that you pay more attention to your constituency, well, because they are watching you through newspapers. And eventually that leads to changes in policies, because what you see is that congressmen who now, you see they exert more effort and they pay more attention to their constituency, they manage to bring more federal spending to their districts. So basically, in the end, these districts getting more resources. And there are very similar findings actually from radio from 1920s in the US, that basically more informed constituencies get more money because they are more informed, they pay more attention, they are more active in voting. That's why politicians also pay more attention to them and they pay more effort to bring more money. So in terms of regional inequality, that appears to be a very important factor. Areas in which there's more access to mass media or more active mass media that delivers more information about politicians, in these areas, voters pay more attention to politicians, and in the end, through accountability mechanisms, that means that politicians bring more money to this area. So more informed areas benefit materially from getting this information in the political process. So this is a very important observation that actually, again, can be repeated in different settings. Information, political information, through all these channels translates into getting more resources. Okay, so any questions about this paper and the mechanisms behind this?
Yes, can I ask a question for this exogenous variation in the first place? Because I don't know so much about the US politician system. So why in the area that they start with a more diverse, like the voting attitudes towards different people? It's because in the first place, they don't care about politics that much. So they don't talk with the neighborhoods, with each other. So is this definitely exogenous? Yeah.
So this is a great question, because basically that's exactly, raises a question. If your area in which your newspaper is being sold is divided between different congressional districts, and congressional districts, it's not, again, we're talking about overlap of area in which your newspaper is being sold with the congressional districts. Congressional district is a formal administrative division. In the same congressional district, everyone votes for one candidate, and other districts vote for different. So it doesn't tell you anything actually about political, unless we go into gerrymandering issues, it doesn't tell you necessarily that people in the same congressional district have the same preferences. So it's not about political preferences, it's about district. But still, it raises the question like why this happens, and it may tell you something about political kind of salience of political issues in this area. So if people in this district care so much about politics, as a newspaper, I probably want to fill the whole district. So that's why what I said is what's very important is that they use to fix the facts, look at only at the changes in the congressional district. So basically what happens is that you can have like this area in which your newspaper is being sold, and suppose you start, for example, with like being coincided like the same district. But then every 10 years in the US, they redraw the borders of the congressional districts. And it's done, like it has nothing to do with newspapers. It's done by state Congress. The rational reason is that it's because of changes in population. Different districts have to have approximately the same population. It can be, in the end, it can happen so that after this redistricting, then your area of newspaper being split into different districts. So then you study the same newspaper and you compare it before and after redrawing the districts. And then kind of the assumption here is then once they redraw the districts, they don't pay attention to where newspapers are sold. And as a newspaper, then you want to adjust the area in which you're being sold. But at the moment when they redraw districts, it's completely beyond your control. You used to be, for example, you lived in a nice kind of setting which all your readers were in the same district, and then suddenly, as a shock, it turns out now you're divided between the districts. You don't know which congressman to cover and all that. So but this is a very important issue. So this redistricting part in the paper is very important to persuade that it's unrelated. Any other questions? Okay, good. Then let's try to move on, because I wanted to at least not at such depth, but cover, I think, what is very important issue is how this effect of mass media change because of changing technology, and mainly the advent of the new media. Everything has to do with related with internet, because there is a kind of, I think by now there's a, if not consensus, but at least suspicion that the change in technology and coming of internet, must be social media, etc., actually has very important political implications. And there's actually quite a lot of evidence now about the effect of internet per se on the working of mass media, how it's first, how the information delivered by mass media is changing. But more, again, it's a separate issue. What is more important for us is how the coming of these new technologies, how it changes the behavior of the people. And so the first broad question is how internet, just now you have access to broad internet, affects the political behavior of the people. So, and there's more and more evidence that shows, for example, that in general it decreases turnout. People start voting. But actually, so this is a study by Germany by Falgold and Hablik. But now, but then there was another study from Italy by Campante, Durante, and Sobri that showed that may be temporary. So there's temporary drop in turnout. Then there's an increase in other forms of political engagement, mainly organizing political groups in social media, etc. And then turnout goes up again. But the different groups of voters are mobilized. So this is a kind of interesting feature of the effect of internet in democracies, and I'll talk more about the important paper that goes into more details about this. But also there is an interesting, if you like, not focus not only on democracies but across the world. There's evidence, for example, that just having access to internet actually promotes political competition and actually can foster democratization. For example, the effect of internet in the paper by Miner in Malaysia shows that that was help democratizations. But in general, now this paper by Guriev, Melnikov, and Zhraska that is forthcoming in Q2G shows that the spread of 3G technology that actually decreased, on average, it decreased support of governments everywhere. So the more information you have about governments, the less you trust in almost any country. But it's very well correlated. The more corrupt countries, the trust goes way more down. And that goes, and again, the next finding is that it actually works the most in areas in which traditional media are not fully free. So internet, at least as it's not censored. I mean, they would not. If we talk about countries like China, that's like a different story. The internet is pretty much controlled there. But in countries in which internet is sufficiently free, then actually it seems like you get much more information. And if before that the government was corrupt and controlling newspapers and radio, that additional information makes people to change their beliefs quite radically and stop supporting the government. So that is kind of, I think, what are currently the main findings. But I wanted to focus on one particular paper because I think it's important, exactly from the point of view of inequality and access to internet and how it can affect inequality in democracies. So this paper is a recent paper on the effect of internet in politics in UK. And well, disclaimer, nothing to do with Brexit. It was written before Brexit, so like no fun stories. It was really boring politics, but very much related to inequality. And basically, kind of the question there is how internet affects the news consumption by people, how it affects elections, and how it affects government policies. All the main ingredients. And it looks at the UK local elections and local governments. Just because first you want to you can find variation, as I tell you now, we're coming from quasi-exogenous variation in penetration of broadband internet in UK. Second, there's actually more variation across different local governments in terms of how they spend money, how they can also raise their own taxes. So there's quite a lot of variation in revenues and expenditures of local government. So there's more to study. And actually kind of you can look at more heterogeneous effects. So like at the local level, you can see a lot of look at the mechanism more. And that's why they study local governments. And rather than looking at the national elections, especially for policies, obviously, like you can only look at the variation in policies at the local level. So what they do is they find a IV based on the weather. But before that, just like and the specifics of going to specifics of UK weather, just to understand like the setting. The setting is 2000s. That's why there's no Brexit yet. It's like focus on the period between 2000 and 2011, because at that point, most of the internet was broadband internet basically by cable, and to get it, they were mostly getting this cable internet through this telephone network, pre-existing telephone network that needed you to collect to this whatever local exchanges. So these are kind of physically buildings in which a lot of cables commute. And that was important technologically for IV, as I will mention next slide. But again, like the setting is that in this decade, the share of households that were using broadband internet increased from basically less than 10, it was like 7%, to more than 75%. So like huge increase in the usage of broadband internet, but very different in different regions of UK. And and also, so this is one important thing to bear in mind. And another very important thing to bear in mind, just in terms of summary statistics for interpretation, is how do people, once they get this program, how they used it. So there were internet usage surveys conducted at that time. And what was happening is that you see that people with higher education, like university, etc., a lot of them were using internet to get information and get access to news. Whereas people with less education were way more likely to use it only for communicating, playing games, and like music, video, etc., basic entertainment. So this is a very important, and the same with age. Young people are more likely to use it for entertainment. Older people are more likely to use it relatively to young people to get news. So basically you can see that there are two kind of dimensions of heterogeneity. First, some regions get internet, some don't. And within these regions, once you get internet, some people use it to get news and information. Some people use it for internet, for entertainment purposes only. So, and that can actually, both of these dimensions can lead to huge implications for inequality. But before that, technical thing is like empirical analysis is, you look at the effect of internet trying to control for all forcible fixed effects, etc. The most interesting thing is where you get from exogenous variation. OLS is not very interesting. So what happens is like what our UK is famous for turns out to, and whether at least archetypical, turns out to work well as an instrument. So everyone, I don't know, at least I have this archetype of London where it's always raining. And it's cloudy, raining, etc. And it turns out to be that it works for the purposes of econometric analysis as well. The amount of rain turns out to be a good predictor of the spread of internet, because when there is too much raining, these local exchanges, they can get flooded and the internet doesn't work that well. So it seems like a minor thing, but in terms of spread of internet, it turns out to play quite an important role. Because if you look at the map of rain intensity, and then you look at the map of broadband diffusion, well, it's hard to run regressions visually, but probably you can see that the heat map is kind of resembles each other. The areas in which you have a lot of rain. Of rain, you don't like there the internet spreads not that fast, and if you zoom in on particular basically like counties, like really small areas, the same thing happens. The more rain you have, at least the more variation in rain you have, like the more extreme rain you have, the less slower is the spread of broadband internet. So basically, you can use this finding to look at, well, as quasi-exogenous variation, to look at the causal effect of broadband using the RAIN as instrument on the political behavior. I mean, obviously, there's a consideration, maybe RAIN affects political behavior like directly, you're depressed and you vote differently, but you can look at the 90s when there was no internet and see that RAIN does not affect political outcomes directly. So well, people in the UK are used to it, so they don't pay attention when they're voting about the amount of RAIN, but the internet still does pay attention. So using this instrument, you can see the effect of internet, and what you can see are several interesting findings. So first, what you see, if you look for, first start looking at turnout, because as I said, and as we see just in the paper of Snyder and Stromberg, that's a very important thing. Like if you vote, if you are more informed, you're more likely to vote, politicians pay more attention to you, and then you get some goodies for that. So if you don't vote, you win, you lose from it. And it turned out to look at the more internet you have, it decreases turnout by young people. And by people with lower education. So it's especially young and uneducated. But here, given the data constraints, you can only spread it in half. So again, areas with lower education, there is a negative effect on turnout. If you look at areas with high education or with older generation, there's no effect on turnout. So it doesn't affect turnout. So same thing goes for people with, if you compare people like with low socioeconomic status and high socioeconomic status, basically sometimes poor and rich, actually kind of there, the turnout goes down in both categories. But for poor, if you look at the magnitude, it's twice as much as for rich people. So basically kind of the story as it goes, like the internet comes, but people use it for different reasons. And poor, uneducated young people, they use it for entertainment. In the end, they consume less news, they become less informed, and then they don't go to vote. For older, more educated, and richer people, at least this entertainment part is compensated by the fact that they also get more news. So in the end, it doesn't affect their political behavior, or it does not affect it that much. I mean, on average, it's still like the effect is negative for everyone. Internet is bad for political participation, but it's especially bad for uneducated, young and poor people. And then you see, as in the paper of Stromberg and Snyder, you see that it directly translates into policies, because in the end, you see, since you can imagine, if poor, uneducated, and younger people stop going to vote, well, the policies that aim at young, poor, and uneducated, they will be deprioritized. And in fact, you see that there's a decrease in overall expenditures, because really rich people don't want to pay taxes and they don't want to spend. So the taxes go down, the spending goes down, and especially the spending on the housing and social services. This basically something that directly helps poor and young. It's a context of UK. So, but this you can see, think about this as public goods that benefit poor and young people. They get the expenditure on them goes down. Whereas if you look at public goods that are targeted to more educated and richer people, which is education, meaning schools, they all care about schools for their children. The spending on them, there is decrease, but it's not significant. And also, like if you take into account that the taxes go down, it means that the share of expenditures allocated to education is actually increasing. So in the end, basically the interpretation is that the policies are now becoming tilted towards preferences of the older, rich, and educated people, just because they the turnout in elections stayed the same, whereas for poor, young, and uneducated people, it went down. So politicians paid more attention to these people, and that really has a serious effect on inequality. So, and the magnitude of the effects, if you look at it, I mean, you can make calculations, is actually kind of, I mean, it's pretty significant. If you, I mean, it looks small, that expenditures go down by 0.28%, but once you start multiplying and like by people, et cetera, in the end, that's a substantial amount of money per person. So you really have to pay attention. And this is, again, this is a methodological question. Don't only look at statistical significance. You have to look at economic significance. It can be very statistically significant and completely useless effect because it doesn't affect anything. So here, it's not only statistically significant, it's economically significant. So it can have a substantial effect on inequality. So basically, the conclusion is that you do see an effect of internet on engagement of people, political engagement. It decreases. So the more availability of internet decreases political participation of people. What is so, which is already bad from the point of view of accountability, because then the political participation goes down. Politicians can do whatever they want, at least more of whatever they want. But from the point of view of inequality, what is really important is that the participation goes down differently for different social groups, and for most vulnerable groups, they are affected the most. They stop coming to elections relatively kind of more. The drop is more, and in the end, they lose out in terms of policies as well. So basically, spread of internet made policies towards shift towards policies that promote an increase in inequality, just because of heterogeneous reaction of the people to the access of internet. Wait. So this is this paper. Any questions about this paper?
May I have a question?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Actually, I'm in London, so I know how heavy the rain is here. So we are really enjoying the rain. By the way, could you go back to the first stage of this paper, the table of the first stage result? So the next one, I guess, probably it's too much.
This one.
Yeah. Based on my understanding, the first stage IB is the rain, and the first stage outcome is the internet, right? But I read some newspaper on the Brexit voting. Some people didn't go to the voting because of the heavy rain of flood. So the rain might directly affect the second stage outcome, the turnout, for example. So I wonder how we can interpret this result if that happens. And I read some research articles saying that as well. So I'm kind of doubt the validity of this idea actually.
Yeah. So this is a great question. So there are two answers to this question. So first of all, here, when we look at the, so first, it's true that rain affects turnout. There will, it's across the, not only valid for UK, it's there are findings for US as well. In bad weather, people vote less. I mean, voting, you don't want to get your feet wet just because of voting, at least for something. But that is true only for rain on the day of elections.
Nice.
Not before. So here, the rain in the first stage, it's rain before. So it's like internet before the elections, and they can control for rain on the day of elections, doesn't matter. First. Second, they do exactly the same for the 90s. Because you can also think that maybe, well, it was raining the whole month before elections, I'm depressed, I'll vote differently. Well, at least in the 90s, it was not before internet appeared as an important thing. It was not happening. So in principle, this is a very important consideration, but they try to control these two things.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So
can I ask one more question just on these slides? So what's really bothers me is the second column is a green election day. So why when it's raining, there's more turnouts in log form.
Oh, this one, yeah, this is, yes, sorry, like with the stress, I guess, and read this, because that is, I also find it a very puzzling result that I cannot understand. But this is also like, it's true, if you see it, it's true only for low educated people, educated people. And this is, again, as we just said, this is for hearers, but it's also like for old and poor people. And that is something that the paper doesn't have an answer to. And I also don't have an answer to. Except for, I don't know, maybe there's something, since I've never lived in the UK, I don't know. Maybe there's a traditional, like you go to vote and you go to a pub or something. So when it's raining, you're more like the incentives to go to the pub increase. So you go vote and you go then talk with your neighbors about like how you just voted in the pub. I think that's only a reasonable explanation that I can come up with.
Sorry, it could also be something like if you're low educated, that maybe you're more likely to not have a car. So you're more likely to have to take the bus or to walk. So the rain is going to be a different kind of deterrent, right?
Yes, but then you expect it to be more of a deterrent, and then you expect a negative effect. So, really, like these poor people really want to feel wet, and that's why they're more likely to go. Or maybe you have to signal that you're serious about voting. So if it's sunny, well, everyone can vote when it's sunny. When it's raining, that's when you prove that you're real serious voter. I don't know. So actually, really serious, it contradicts most of the findings.
That's weird.
in other countries. So usually, rain is a good instrument for voting, for et cetera, in the opposite direction. So this is a very UK specific finding. And I honestly don't know why. Okay, so Mary Alice, you have raised your hand so politely.
I just wanted to ask, the result that more internet access would decrease voting. I mean, is there much research that looks into exactly why that is? Because it just seems kind of odd to me that like you'd be playing computer games or something instead of voting that have such a large effect that it would stop you from voting.
Yep. Yeah, I think now there's it's maybe not in economics, so they're not. I haven't seen good studies of this, but other like in political science, more detailed, not quasi-exhaustive, but more detailed like diaries, etc. For example, Marcus Pryor from Princeton, I think he's still in Princeton, had a book about this. They actually tried to solve it, and they all actually document this. And most of this explanation is that the kind of similar to what happened when you get what in this paper. What happens when you get internet? Internet has two things from point of view of information and politics. First, you get access to more information. That's a good thing, and it should increase. But second, you have much more high quality entertainment. And that's a different thing. That's a different mechanism that crowds out time. So you spend more time. So it's easier to get information, but you have less time to do it because you're busy playing games, using the internet or reading some whatever fun stuff. And in the end, it looks like the second mechanism is more important. It dominates the first, at least on average. For people, then again, as in this paper, you see it's different for different classes of people. For highly educated, rich people, the entertainment mechanism is at least well balanced by the mechanism of availability of information. But by poor and less educated people, mostly the entertainment mechanism dominates the availability of information. So so this is a very kind of interesting situation for poor people is that they have access to more information, but they are less likely to use it. Easier, but so many distractions, so many interesting, entertaining things on the internet. We just don't have time to read serious stuff about politics, and then in the end we'll know less and we don't vote. So this entertainment channel is it turned out to be very important. Actually, the same finding was for cable TV. When cable TV came, the political knowledge dropped quite significantly. Because if previously you had whatever, like 4 different national TV channels, you wanted to watch whatever, movies or whatever, and in between them, you were forced to watch news, just while you were waiting for another entertainment. With cable TV, you don't need this. You just turn on your movies and you watch them without news, and in the end, that end up bringing down information. And in general, I think this is that most of the people don't care about news, and they have to be, in some sense, fed this news like almost against their will, so that they know something about serious stuff about politics. Most of the people just don't care. When people, I think this is a very, very important conclusion. When we discuss about knowledge, political knowledge, mostly we talk about, especially now in the context of the US, but more Europe as well, with polarization, populism, etc. Mostly, like, we talk about how extremes are views, so you get wrong views, etc. The real issue is most of the people don't get any views, don't get any political information, be it right, left wing, whatever. Most of the people are ignorant. Ignorance seems to be a way more important issue than biased knowledge on average. So I think this is kind of my reading, at least of the literature that exists now on these facts. Okay, any other questions? Okay, hopefully I answered this one. Yeah. Okay, if there are no questions, let's take a break, which we were supposed to take 15 minutes ago. Let's make it a little bit shorter. Then I will finish with information inequality and then talk a little bit more about inequality and education-driven peer effects. So let's continue. So the last paper that we talked about was talking about general effect of internet. And as we mentioned, like it involves a lot of potential mechanisms for entertainment channels, provision of information, email communication, a lot of it. But one of the what the recently have become probably one of the most important features of and mechanisms for which internet is affecting the spread of information is this the social media. And basically, the advent of social media as one of the main, if not the main, sources of information in some countries. So as of the first quarter of 2021, the monthly audience of active users, only active users, was almost 3 billion people. So it makes Facebook for in particular. This is the number for Facebook for one particular social media. If you combine all social media, then it's clearly like the vast majority of the population of the world is using the mass media. And if you look at the places like US, more than a third of people already get news regularly, specifically from Facebook. And what is special about social media is that it has some certain features that make it potentially kind of quite different from traditional media, and that can have specific effects. And we have a survey with Ekaterina Zhuravskaya and Maria Petrova in the annual review of economics last year, talking about exactly this, the social media and political effects of it, through 2 main special features that distinguish social media from traditional media. And one is a very low barriers to entry for people who write and communicate, like for people who want to spread information. And the second one, tightly related to this, slightly different, is that it allows for horizontal flow of information between individual users. So unlike newspapers, which comes from like bottom to top, the editor decides which information to write, and then everyone else consumes the readers. Here, because social media is basically user-generated content, then you can with all the likes, comments, etc., there's much more of this horizontal exchange of information between the users. And that can have potentially very important consequences that all that can also be related to inequality. So again, the main point is a comparison with the traditional media. As I mentioned, the first important feature of social media is that they're very low barriers to entry. Again, like previously, if you wanted to transmit like a TV broadcast, TV channel, that's extremely costly and have some registration. Same thing for radio channels, even for newspapers. That's a costly procedure with special licensing, etc. If you want to start your own newspaper, etc., there are quite significant costs. Even if you want to organize your own online newspaper, at that time you have to create your own website, etc. That's still some barriers to entry. In the social media, the only thing that you need to do is to register your own account. You immediately become a producer of information. So this is really low barriers to entry, and but in practical terms, what it means, it means that what is called gatekeeping on information, meaning just trying to affect mass media so they don't spread some negative information about you, whether you're a politician or a big corporation, becomes almost impossible in social media. Because what happens, like in traditional media, there was a limited number of TV channels, limited number of newspapers, and if you want to conceal some information, you basically can bribe all of them so that they don't, or threaten all of them so they don't post and provide this information. Social media, because of such low barriers to entry, if you start bribing every blogger so that they don't write something, well, that will be quite an increase in the number of bloggers that want to write about this, since we will want to get all these bribes to start with. And threatening millions of people also becomes hard. You can still control it through censorship, but it's really, really hard. I mean, there are not so many countries in which physically and organizationally they were able to achieve this. I mean, like China is one example. Even there are some limits to this with the use of VPN and quite a lot of evidence of actually using social media to transmit ideas that are not always kind of supported by the leadership of the country. So there are limits, but in principle, at least it makes it much harder. It's way easier to control traditional media. So that in principle, it provides an outlet for positional whistleblowers to provide information that is being concealed with traditional media. We, for example, have this paper on based on the Russian experience. So like one famous person become like a whistleblower and started exposing corrupt practices of the companies, actually had an effect on stock market prices. And basically then it led to change in the managerial practices. Actually this whistleblowing channel by social media seems to be like there's empirical evidence that show that it's indeed the case. Social media can be more effectively used by whistleblowers to provide some damaging information. Actually, in general, concealing information in the age of internet and social media becomes way harder. There are other ways. Again, we all know that there are other tactics that they can use, and instead of just concealing, you can do the other thing. You can like flood internet with tons of irrelevant information, so people will get lost, and you cannot get what is right and what is wrong. So you can conceal information not by preventing it from being spread, by distracting attention of people. That seems to be what is working in social media, but just preventing information from getting published in social media becomes way harder. The problem is that it sounds so nice that barriers to entry, whistleblowers, they can write about corruption, everything is good, great. The unfortunate fact is that sometimes you actually want to have barriers for information. For example, you want to cut off some real extremism, people, terrorists and extremists from being able to publish in social media, and there you can quite easily do it in traditional media. In social media, it's much harder, and so there are evidence that actually social media is more conducive to spread of extremist ideas and actually leads to quite tangible outcomes as an increase in hate crimes. So there are works by Miller and Schwartz that documented in Germany, US, we document the same thing in Russia. So there is also dark side of this low barriers to entry of social media that we observe. Another problem with that is that when everyone can write, it sort of undermines reputational mechanism, and the assurance of the quality of information becomes much harder. So if you have a limited number of newspapers, the big newspapers, they have the brand name to take care of, they have rents, basically, that they gave because of their monopolistic position. So they have all incentives to invest, for example, in fact checking and all that stuff, and like good quality journalism, just to improve their reputation. And then the stakes are very high. So you don't want to lose your reputation because you can lose your rents of being this newspaper, the big newspaper. So in social media, the rents are much lower, and because of that, the stakes are lower. So the incentives to care about your reputation are also lower. And in the end, that may leads to a situation in which it's really hard to figure out and to construct this reputational mechanism that people trust certain sources of social media more than kind of sufficiently to make sure that they take information that comes from there with sufficient level of trust. Again, on average. So you can have your own like well trusted blogger that you follow, but on average that becomes a problem. On all this quality assurance reputational mechanisms that are described, for example, in the paper of Gansky and Shapira, they are under kind of become questionable. But I mean, literally in real life, that means that, well, if I say that I read something in New York Times, people trust it more than you say I read it in Facebook. Well, by whatever, someone. You have to prove that it's actually something true and not just a weird thing that a weird blogger brought. So the reputational thing, it becomes a problem, and that is connected to the huge issue of the fake news. And social media, at least, I mean, there's again mounting evidence on this, that social media is really conducive to the spread of fake news, which, I mean, in some sense, fake news is nothing new. They just used to be called rumors. Now they can call fake news, but there is indeed something special about fake news being spread in social media. One is related to this low reputation. Second, there are now several papers that show that a lot of the problems have to do with the fake news. They trigger very emotional reactions in people. And if you can easily share news in social media, that makes it much easier to spread exactly for this like emotional and usually like wrong news with like catchy titles, etc., which use whatever we associate with fake news. Because people read something, they emotionally react, they share it or they spread it, and then they think. So there are papers that basically that show that fake news spread faster and go, like if you see the tree of shares, reshares, and tweets and retweets, they spread like deeper. So there will be more like stages of retweets for fake news compared to real news. And at the individual level, I mean, by now, like at least the main explanation is that this is this emotional reaction on fake news that drives it. So there's a paper now, a recent paper by Gruevsky that also show that just introducing a small that shows that basically two things. First, fighting fake information, fake news by providing correct information is almost useless. People read it, they say, "Oh yeah, it's wrong," but they still remember it. So fake news still have it's not that easy. It's just providing correct information is not enough to fight the fake news. But this is the bad news. The good news is that just introducing just a small additional cost to resharing, meaning that you have to, well, basically one more click. When you share the news, you just click, "I want to share the news," and then the window pops up and asks, "Do you really want to share this news?" Well, if you want, yeah, you can share. You can click the second tab. It reduces the spread of fake news basically really dramatically. Because when you have to think twice, this like emotional reaction, "Oh, I've just read this amazing news," and then you're being asked, like, "Do you really want to share this amazing news?" It gives you this, whatever, like several additional seconds to think, and that's enough to trigger your kind of more rational part of the brain. And then people really share the fake news. The ratio of spreading fake news drops dramatically. So the proper design of social media potentially can solve this issue quite effectively. Without any infringing any individual rights and putting any constraints on people what they want to share and how they want to share. They just introduce a small, that there is a cooling off period in a lot of activities that can involve like emotional reactions. So there's a very standard thing in cooling off in marriage in a lot of countries. So if you just want to come and we want to marry, they say, yes, right, just come next day. Next day if you don't change your mind, we will marry you. But just for one day, think about it. Same thing with financial decisions, big financial decisions. There's a cooling off period that you can say, I want to buy this, whatever, take the mortgage, and say, yes, we'll give the mortgage tomorrow, if you still want it. Same thing seems to be working with fake news, just on a different scale. Just think for 3 seconds if you want to share it, and then it already works. So I think it fully falls into this framework of two systems by Daniel Kahneman that really like 2-3 seconds are enough to start your non-emotional but your rational brain part to start working. So I think it fully coincides with the behavioral economics findings, recent ones. So, but fake news are really important because there's evidence in terms of inequality that there's a huge heterogeneity on what type of people become more like a victim of fake news. And as a result, victims of misinformation. So one dimension is that people who have less experience with computers, so basically older people, are have less experience of dealing with this, so they're actually more vulnerable to spreading of fake news. So it turns out it's an interesting finding that older people, they're much less active users of social media in general, but much more active spreaders of fake news. Exactly because they kind of, like the young generation already has more experience with social media, so they have more critical attitude to whatever is being written there. But again, it's also connected to being educated, to lower high level of education. Unfortunately, there are quite a lot of very well-educated people who still spread fake news, but if we believe in this theory, there are emotional, highly educated people who tweet or share things in Facebook before thinking, and then they realize that it's wrong, but it's too late. They already shared it. But in general, also like lower educated people are more subject to this. So from the point of view of inequality, that's also very important, because people, the quality of the news that you get from social media turns out also in the end to depend on your initial conditions. And Finally, what we also know, what also very kind of important dramatic effect is the effect of that we've already touched upon, that the social media actually promotes polarization because of this confirmation bias, because the people want to listen only to the views that they like. In the internet, they really can find whatever crazy idea you have, you can find people who will support it, and they will persuade you that you are actually right. And so you can live in your this, the standard term is an echo chamber, that you listen only to people who support your ideas, regardless how relevant they are, how crazy they are, and you become even more and more persuaded that you are right and everyone else is wrong, which leads to like increasing polarization. Actually, there from the point of view of academic papers, actually for several years there were some skepticism. There were papers that were showing that polarization is actually increasing, that was showing that it's they were more skeptical. I think that by now there's a quite persuasive paper by the Untitled with co-authors in AR last year, in which basically in an experiment they showed that that if you pay people to abstain from using Facebook for 1 month, then polarization among in these people who haven't used for Facebook, they can be kind of very again in the context of US, the polarization between these people actually decreases. In 1 month of not using Facebook makes liberal less extremely left-wing and the more conservative people less extremely right. So they converge to more centrist positions. So by now, I think that there's plenty of kind of not plenty, but the quality of evidence is sufficiently high to say that social media really increases polarization, and that again that can lead to very damaging political channel kind of effects in political economy. On top of the slow barriers to entry, there's another thing about social media: this horizontal flows of information. What people not only get information, you immediately see what your friends think about it and how they commented on it, who shared it. So there's much more information. Not just some political statement, but what like the horizontal kind of information from your friends, who's thinking what about this, and that can be very important when we talk about any collective action. When we need to do something together, it's really important to know what other people, like your friends, your and acquaintances, think about it. So if in a newspaper you just write, we go on a rally tomorrow. You don't know how many people or the readers take seriously this call for action. In social media, you can very quickly get a feedback how many people agree with the statement, how many of them actually want to go on this rally, etc. So that can actually help a lot reduce the cost of collective action and induce people to do something together, like, for example, going in protest. And we have the paper again with Maria Petrova and Alexei Makai in the Econometrica last year, when we show that actually that's true. Spread, like when social media spreads, the probability of having political process increases. And that is actually, again, for political reasons, from the point of view of policies, that can be very important, because there are other papers that show that even in democracies, going on protests actually a very important tool for shifting public policies in the direction preferred by the protesters. So there's a very famous paper by Madestam with co-authors on the Tea Party movement in the US that actually reduced drain, as we already mentioned, as an instrument. So people don't go on rallies that much if it's raining. If you use it as an instrument, you show that basically protesters, they do get their way later on. So if you go and protest supporting particular ideology, like in Tea Party movement, that was anti-tax, like quite conservative movement, then all the policies later on will be more tilted towards in this direction. The voting becomes more conservative. The policies that local politicians adopt are more conservative. The senators congressmen start voting more conservative. So political rallies are a very important tool. And to the extent social media makes it easier to to participate in these collective actions that can also have very important political implications, which in addition to this coordination channel, that also becomes also important because all these effects are amplified through this kind of social image concern. So if all my friends go to vote, I feel bad not to vote and not to then post on the Facebook. Like, there was a famous Facebook experiment when people were voting and then posting like I voted on their front page. So that was a very kind of powerful way to induce people also to go to vote and put on their page, I also vote. Well, my friends vote, yeah, I also vote, because this becomes this social signaling device. I want to be to my friend like my friends, and I want to signal to them like I'm one of them. So I'll mention this in the education context in the end of this, the second part of this smaller part of this lecture. But that's kind of social image concerns become even more important in social media. A lot of our behavior is changed by what we observe that other people are doing Facebook, and we want to signal to them that we are behaving like that. So, but trying to conclude about this general topic of information equality, especially it was always true, but especially in the current economy, which is to a large extent knowledge-based economy. The outcomes of the people, and that when we talk about inequality, we usually think about some welfare measures, how people behave. If we even look at this welfare measures, they are to a great extent depend on what information people have or don't have, or how the quality of information. And mass media, including the new social media, plays a huge role in this, because and that is the main source of information at the macro level that is available to large masses of people at the same time. So if we want to look at the big general equilibrium fact, mass media becomes hugely important. And availability, so there are two things that are directly related to inequality issues. First, just the fact whether you have access to certain to mass media or not, or certain channels, plays a very big role, because the more access you have, the more information you have, through political process in the end, the more benefits you get from the state. So being informed is always good. You always win something from being informed, and uninformed people basically are exploited by political system. So just being informed or not informed is very important. Again, even first directly, because, well, if you have correct information, you like some financial products are available or not, you have information, you get direct benefit from using better financial products. But today I was focusing more on indirect effects for political system that uninformed people are getting a bit more exploited. But on top of that, especially with the advent of the new media, social media, what also becomes extremely important is that it matters not only whether you have access or not, it's how you exploit these new sources of information. And the heterogeneity in terms of using news media becomes very important. It's mentioned, like, if you use Facebook or internet in general, mostly for entertainment purposes, you will have one welfare effect. If you use it to get information, useful information, news, etc., that will be a very different effect on your welfare measures. So, and in policy debate, people mostly focus on what they usually call digital divide. That basically some people get internet or not. If you don't get access to internet, you lose a lot in today's economy, which is true, definitely. You lose a lot of employment opportunity. You lose a lot, by now, educational opportunity. Well, without internet, for example, you wouldn't be able to participate in this summer school. So clearly it's important whether you have it or not. But on top of that, what makes it more complicated, that's it's not enough to have access. It's also extremely important how to use this tool. Social media and internet is a tool that can be very easily misused, that can have a potentially bad welfare the fact, because again, just sorry, but the same paper that I mentioned by Hunt Elkott with co-authors on the effect of polarization Facebook that paid people not to use Facebook for 1 month. It also showed that if you don't use Facebook for 1 month, your welfare goes up. So you will feel better if you force yourself to limit usage of Facebook. Actually, they had another paper that really shows that Facebook and digital media in general, they have this addictive features that actually make it welfare reducing. So this becomes like an addictive habit that people try to fight with. And that's, again, how different types of people address this challenge leads to very important welfare and inequality consequences. So that's what I wanted to stress, that information inequality, people talk about, usually just to bring some other perspective on inequality. People usually talk about inequality in terms of, how access to the wealth of your parents, educational, which is extremely important. I don't doubt that. But I think that people, the issue of informational equality is not, people don't pay sufficient attention to it. So I wanted to stress this. But okay, any questions about the general topic, information inequality, or more specific ones?
I have a question. Okay.
Sure.
I'm sorry if I missed at some point, but I'm interested in how the network is creating where the information flows. For example, in the social media, if you say the President Trump, you might want to follow the Trump Twitter, although his account is already deactivated. Or maybe you like the Obama or Biden, you might not want to follow the Trump's Twitter. So maybe the kind of network formation in the political way is kind of really different between these people. So is there any paper or literature on that kind, formatting network in the sense that on the SNS or in the political sense?
Yes, there's that is an extremely interesting question that people started studying. Because people were always interested in studying networks and network formation. And there's quite a lot of literature, well, not quite a lot, but there is a literature on that, on offline networks, for example. Actually, the problem with they're empirical. There are not so many data sets on networks. So there are some, for example, that the data set on networks of high school students in the US, and it was used over and over all, again, in empirical literature. So if you are interested, I think one of the gurus in this profession is Matt Jackson from Stanford, Matthew Jackson. So he has a course on networks and he has several empirical papers. Now people started studying online social networks as well, because the data very is much more easily available. So there's growing field. The main finding everywhere is that there's the networks are formed to promote homophily. So people really like to form networks of people who are very similar to them. There's not so much work, to the best of my knowledge, that combine the offline and online work. So we actually now working on a paper like this with Maria Petrova and Adam Zadel on actually kind of trying to, in the same model and same empirical setting, trying to establish the setting in which people have offline networks, and then they have a choice to join online networks, form networks there. So how your online network will respond and change with respect to your offline network. So basically, and then there's the basically kind of for now we're working with ethnic minorities. So basically the idea is that if you live in a city in which, and you are a member of ethnic minority, and there are not enough people of your minority in this city, you will use online networks as a substitute. You are more likely to join online networks. And once you join online networks, you'll be more selective in trying to find people of your ethnic minority in online, because basically in some sense you don't have enough in offline network. So you kind of complement it with your online. So at least these are our preliminary results, but we are really working now on this.
I see. So maybe the person might change the behavior in the offline network inside the neighborhood based on the influence of the online network.
Yes, yes. I think that is a second. Like we're not there yet. I think it's very challenging in terms of empirical data. But yes, I think it's totally true. Like the fact that now you have online network available will change how you form your offline network as well.
I see. Thank you very much. It's
So
really
for now we are able to answer a different question. Your offline network changes in it will affect your how you form your online network. But I'm absolutely sure that it works the other way around, because people, I'm pretty much sure that people treat it as in general. So I have online, offline, and I have a combination of online and offline that satisfied my personal needs. So each of this network will have an effect, spillover effect on others.
I see. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so Olga, you have a question?
Thank you very much. I'm interested in the evidence that you said that this double click or the question whether you really want to share this news may reduce the probability of sharing. And could you please tell us whether it was an experiment on that, how this result was found?
Yeah, it was an experiment. So it was, in some sense, as any experiment, it was slightly artificial setting, because they couldn't persuade any existing network to introduce this. The additional click. So it's in the context of French elections. There were like there were some basically fake statements by Marine Le Pen, and then there was a factual check that she's not doing it correct. So there was one intervention, and second, there was like kind of so there was like people doing this online, and then you were asked like, well, you can share now this statement by Marine Le Pen, then you have to confirm it, and then it was actually posted on your Facebook. But so it was semi-real in the sense that the questions, that it was like online survey designed by the researchers, but the actual outcome was supposed to be a post in a real social network. So, but yeah, you can see it's a working paper by Sergei Guriev, Ekaterina Zhuravskaya, and I should not do this, but I forget the first co-author who is their colleague from Paris. So there are three co-authors, but you can find them by keywords Guriev, Zhuravskaya.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Any other questions on information quality?
I don't have a question, but I was just, when you were talking, it made me kind of think that there might be an opportunity for a paper that I won't write because I've got other papers, but I think I'll put it out there in case someone else is thinking about it. Just because I was thinking about like the natural experiments that you were doing. And I was thinking about this article I was reading in The Economist recently, where they were talking about how because everyone's been in lockdown, people are consuming a lot more digital content, but how that's probably going to change, right? Once people, like media companies are worried, for example, that like, they've started generating all this content at a high level, but then once people can go back to being in real life, they might not want to like consume as much of this. And, they've been charting how, which types of consumption have increased. So like, of the, people, because they're not commuting, they have 15% more free time or whatever. And of that, 30% is going to video games, 10% is going to books, whatever. And I was just thinking that there could be a good natural experiment for someone to look into, because basically you're going to have these lockdowns that are ending, right? So you're going to be able to like look at like how, when the lockdown is ended, and then how the consumption has changed, and then potentially how that has like affected this information asymmetries and things like that. So I don't know, I was just thinking that there might, because the pandemic is just sort of, the lockdowns are starting to lift, there might be like a natural experiment there that someone could use for, I don't know, for something along this topic. So that's it. I was thinking about it, and I thought someone might be able to do something with that.
Okay. Yeah, that may be something that, okay. So you can share with the classmates in this. I guess like everyone who wants to write a paper, co-author, like please, you can address. Okay, so there was also in the chat, there's a question, is the data about internet coverage, for example, that was used at open or not. That depends on like the internet coverage for UK, or there was, for example, like 3G, etc. So in general, it's not free. There are databases that are, but they are available. You can purchase this data. To the best of my knowledge, it's, well, it depends. For students, it's a lot. For researchers, that's a reasonable amount. For professors, it's a reasonable amount that falls usually into like research budget. So it's not that tons of thousands of dollars. It's like several $1,000s for like worldwide coverage, for example, of 3G. I am not aware of any free available data on internet penetration.
So I have one more question here.
Yep.
So I'm just thinking in terms of the terrible impact from the social media. So how much is driven by like users' behavior? It's like you want to say something that you want to confirm your pride, but then how much is actually driven by the algorithm from all these big tech companies? They're just designed in a way that you want to watch something that is going to confirm your belief. That might be like a large driver rather than your like own behavior, right? So is there a way to distinguish that?
There is a paper about this. To take it with a grain of salt, it's been conducted by Facebook Research, but exactly because they were accused of the algorithm. Like I actually, well, that's kind of ironic, but I think we can trust them. I know people who work there; they're decent researchers. Nothing said about the company itself. The people who work in Facebook Research, I know, as good scientists. So they had a paper which exactly tried to tease apart in this polarization and echo chambers what is the most important feature. The network of friends that you have, because basically you can see only things that your friends share or paid advertisement. Like, forget about paid advertisement. Like, in principle, theoretically, you can see only things that are shared by your friends. So that's already a big filter, what your friends see. So if your all friends are liberal and they only post liberal things, that's it. Like that you will only be reading liberal stuff. After that, there's a filter of Facebook algorithm, which chooses among the things that they showed, shared, which things to show you. And then there's a third filter, you yourself. Among the things that Facebook shows you, you click only on some things and read them, and you don't click on other things. So, and you can actually, in terms of magnitude, you can see, and you see that basically you can start with a fully kind of mixed set of stories that are all over like the Facebook. Then you can see the set of stories that are shared by your friends and how they coincide with your political views and how likely you are to see that. And the main effect is at the first stage. The main filter is like the friends that you have in your Facebook. Even if there's no Facebook algorithm and they randomly draw stories shared by your friends, you will have a very, very kind of biased picture of the news. Algorithm also adds on top of that. It becomes even more biased because of Facebook algorithm, and you yourself add even more on this. So even if your friends share something, whatever, from the different side political spectrum, even if Facebook allows you to see it, you yourself try to ignore it. And so in the end, all these three things matter, but in terms of magnitude, it looks like the algorithm is actually the least important. Whom you are subscribed to, your friends, this is the main driving channel. So, well, again, you can read the paper. I think it's in Proceedings of National Academy of Science. I can write the name of the. This is the first co-author on the paper. He's like one of the heads I think he's the head of the New York division of the Facebook research. So he has several really good papers on papers, including one of this on the effects of like social pressure. But I think he's the first co-author on this paper on the filtering. Eitan Bakshi. Okay, so some in the chat which raises the question whether should regulate social media companies. Well, this question of regulation of social media companies, I think now is one of the hottest topics, and it's absolutely clear that they will be regulated. I mean, there's a political tide is clearly turned. The question is only how, and this is a very delicate actually question because I think this paper that I just cited only cited the kind of, at least my reading of the situation in terms of regulation is that a lot of things that people blame directly on social media is just reflection of all the behavioral biases and tendencies of the people themselves. So at first, people should blame themselves. The problem is that social media really exploits these vulnerabilities for their own purposes. Their own purpose is not to make people polarized. They don't care. They don't make money of making you polarized. The main purpose is to get you engaged and spend as much time as possible on their websites. So the real issue is that people themselves, they get more interested in some content that is kind of divisive and problematic in many respects, let me say that. And then they get hooked up on this, and then it leads to this kind of basic addiction, digital addiction, that Facebook and other, not only Facebook, any digital companies try to exploit. So I think like people are currently the public debate is about, well, like we should fight polarization, etc., and maybe some good things can we do, like for example this cool-off period that you have to think twice before sharing something. But I think that actually way more important, and at the root of it is this idea that you want to get people hooked, and you can actually do everything possible to encourage this habit formation and basic addiction to social media. And that is something that potentially can be kind of somehow regulated to get, at least to get people. I'm more on the side of this, I think it's a political stance, but this kind of liberal paternalism is that you don't force people, regulate very lightly, that you get people tools, for example, to fight their own addictions. And if you want to share fake news, fine, you can do it. Just think for 2 seconds if you really can do it. We don't force you just to say that this is a good news, this is bad news, because then it will be equally biased. When Facebook Twitter introduced pre-moderation or whatever is a good speech or not, that raises even more question when they were not doing anything. I guess. So I think that we were talking about this light regulation in terms of nudges, what results in behavioral economics. They like this thing, like some elements of design that minimize the damage. That, in my mind, is much more powerful thing than just ideas of let's break Facebook in two. Well, you have 2 Facebooks, does it make them better or not? I really doubt that. So, but really, people talk more about regulation, but it's such a new beast that people don't really know how to regulate it yet. So I think in the next few years, I think the hottest and the most important policy-related topic will be the regulation of the big tech, including social media. And one thing is obvious, that all the usual methods, the same methods how we regulated whatever Standard Oil, they're completely inappropriate for regulating big tech. They're completely different reasons. So we should mostly forget everything that we knew about competition policies from the past and have to reinvent them new realities. Okay, any other question on this topic? Then let me quickly, I mean, like we only have like less than a half hour, like I just quickly like set the trend, like the topic that I wanted to also. And like the second topic that I wanted to talk about was peer pressure in education, exactly because that's as with information story, information inequality. I think it's a little bit less people pay a little less attention to it than it deserves. I'm really glad that after me there will be Rachel Cranton, who knows way more about identity and social in principle. But I wanted to flag that how important this particular topic is, especially in education. That when we talk about issues with access to education and that certain underprivileged groups don't get enough education, which is true in many instances, in many countries, etc. People always tend to pay attention mostly to the problems with access to resources. So like high quality schools, good quality schools, etc. So it's only like, I mean, if we in the neighborhoods that are problematic, if we only bring good teachers, good resources, etc., everything will be great. And just I wanted to mention that it's more complicated than this. A lot of it has to do not only with economic resources, not pure like money, whatever that are flooded. A lot of it, on top of it, has also issues with this kind of social image concerns and social pressure in the bad neighborhoods and bad schools that people go, and often, as in the case of social media, where you're given a tool, you're just given it's a tool. It's not good or bad in itself, but depending on how you use it, it can be good or bad, or alternative, or at least better or worse. The same is with educational tools. You can bring new wonderful educational programs, but depending on social context, people may not use it or deliberately refuse to use them. And this is exactly what kind of I wanted to talk about in the social image concerns in education, because there is this actually people discuss it a lot from for the last 50 years, starting with Coleman and Dawson study, that how much students gain from education, a lot of it depends not on the kind of inputs that teachers provide, schools provide, professors provide, but on internal motivation of the students themselves. And one of the very important motivation is getting social approval. I want to do something right, as perceived by my peers mainly, and my reference group, which is not usually, occasionally it involves teachers and parents, but mostly students care about their classmates more than about professors. So they want to get approval from that, mostly by the classmates, well, parents, teachers as well, but classmates play a huge role. And sometimes it can get to the situation where something that is long-term good for you, and even you understand it's long-term good for you. For example, studying hard and getting good education. If it's socially disapproved by your peers, you will avoid this behavior. So this is, I mean, it's something in terms when it comes to this racial division, that was something that was coined the hypothesis of acting white. That basically means that kind of it's in the context of U.S. schools. The idea was that if kind of in the problem that people identified in Black communities, was that black students who were even smart ones were deliberately not studying hard, because if they started studying hard and trying to get good grades, they were accused by their peers and by classmates that they're acting white, and they kind of they damage their own identity. And that's, I mean, this was a coin that was coined in this racial context, but actually there's plenty of evidence that it's actually not related to race at all. It's just related to really the context of the classmates that can set their own kind of expectations of your behavior, which can be pro or contra good education. And the idea of the study that I want to show and that documents this is that when this peer pressure exists, it actually becomes very important whether the effort to study or investment in study is observable by your peers or not. Basically, in some sense, if you take it very literally, if you want to, if you are a smart person who wants to study well in this kind of maybe a bit toxic environment, which doesn't approve of studying, if you do it like alone at home so that nobody observes, that's fine. And you get good grades, but nobody knows that you're getting good grades, that's fine. You will study hard. But once it gets public, once your peers and your classmates know that you study hard and they know that you good grades, then you stop studying. So that's kind of the hypothesis, which sounds crazy, but I just wanted to show you empirical evidence that it's true, that it works exactly like this. So the context, the main paper, there were also follow-up papers that studied more details, but the main paper that studied this kind of provided a very nice, clean empirical study of this. An experiment was a paper by Burstyn and Jensen in QG 2015, which studied the students in LA Unified School Districts, the huge districts, one like it's second largest in school system in the US, so it's 700,000 students. And it's very internationally mixed, but again, it's very, all the schools are very heterogeneous in terms of like the quality of the schooling there, that and even between schools and between different classes, which is also very important. So what they did is this, they made an experiment which involved 4 largest high schools in one of the disadvantaged areas of LA. But basically each school was like 3,000 students, so it's a pretty big experiment. So they visited each school. They entered total like 26 total classrooms. This is like it's like 11th out of 12th grade, so you're close to finish. So you're preparing to take this SAT exam, which is needed if you want to unified exam that's needed to if you apply to university. Basically, what they also did, they were coming to a class which can be an honors or non-honors class. So just context of US educational systems, it's not everyone is familiar, is that it's not that you have a class, a set group of classmates with whom you attend all the same classes. Physics, math, whatever, literature will be the same people. They can be different people in different classes. And classes can be kind of advanced level honor classes and kind of normal level non-honors classes. And for each particular subject, you yourself choose whether it's honors or non-honors. That's your choice. So the same person can be attending different number some honors classes in one subject and non-honors classes in some subjects, and different people who have different like a number of honors classes that they take. So basically how they did, like came some honor classes, some non-honor classes, and basically in the end, these 26 classes included more than 800 students. A kind of mix between honors and non-honors, and all of them, what they were offered is a prep course, online prep course for SAT for free. So it's basically, it will help you to prepare for this exam that will help you to get into college. Well, and if you get there, to get financial aid, for example. So it's really good, and it actually pretty expensive. Which basically because it amounted basically $200 for each student. This course. So they important thing that was previously it was not available to students because it was not sold. These courses were not sold kind of to individual customers, to students. They were sold to schools before that, and these schools they were not yet covered. So it was a new product for all the students, but the company was very well known. So they're known that they offered a very good product for free to study for SAT. The only thing they need to do is to say, yes, I want to participate in this class. And the only thing that was different when they were in the experiment was when they came to the class, they introduced that that's a project, that's what will happen. So they had a script, and there was what was mentioned, and the difference was in one word between treatment and control group, because what was saying that you have this option, you can sign up for this class, online class, and then in one group they were said your decision to sign up for the course will be kept completely private from everyone except the other students in this room. So basically kind of implicitly saying, well, other people in this room will know whether you took this class or not. And in the other group, they are saying your decision to sign up for the course will be kept completely private for everyone, including the other students in the room. So the only difference, you're giving the option of take a course class, and the only difference is that in one case, it will be purely anonymous. Nobody will know that you're taking this course. In another case, students sitting in the same classroom will know whether you took it or not. The only difference between this kind of public and private treatment. But what happened was that if you look, so these are the results of the experiment. If you look at the sign-up rate, there was a huge difference in honors class and non-honors class. In honors class, more than 90% of people signed up, regardless of whether it was public or private. And so they're good students. They want to study hard. They're in honors class. The question, who are the remaining 8 or 7% of people who haven't signed up? There's some kind of talk after that basically there were people who already were taking SAT courses, so they didn't need the second SAT course even for free. It was too much for them. Everyone else took this course, regardless of whether it was public or private. But in non-honors class, in which kind of people don't on average classmates don't care that much about education, the sign-up rate was much lower. But most importantly, the private decision, when it was you were signing up and nobody will know about it, was much more, like significantly higher than if it was public. So it was 11 percentage points higher. So there were 11% of people, every 10th person there, wanted to sign up for this class as long as the classmates don't know that I want to study hard. So the problem with a small problem with this is the selection, these honors, like the selection problem is comparing these honors and non-honors class, because they're clearly very different for two reasons. First, the people, like the students themselves who are offered this opportunity, are different. People like students who are in honors class themselves are more likely to be motivated, want to go apply to college, etc. And at the same time, the classmates were different. So what we want to do is to see like how students that are same in terms of their own motivation, how they behave differently depending on who are the classmates. So you want to change the classmates while keeping the motivation of the person the same. So what they can do, I mean, you don't do it experimentally, but what they can do observationally is that As I mentioned, people themselves decide how many honors class to take. So if I tell you, so suppose everyone needs to take 10 different classes in a high school. So if you see a student who takes whatever 10 out of 10 for honors, I don't know if it's physically possible. Maybe, I'm not sure. You will die if you want to take 10 classes for honors. But suppose you can. If you have 10 out of 10, it's like this highly motivated person. And then this, in principle, this highly motivated person can be in the same class with the people who just take this only math course, for example, for honors, and everything else for non-honors. So I will be highly motivated. Everyone is not that much. Conversely, I can be the person who takes only one honors class because whatever, I like math, and everything else is non-honors. Means that I myself am moderately motivated, but among myself, the classmates can be kind of less motivated or non-motivated. So what they do is like, let's look only at students who are on average have the same motivation. Let's take only students who have exactly 2 honor classes. It can be on different subjects, but exactly 2 honor classes. Means that they are approximately well motivated. But then, so you understand that I'm taking 2 honor classes out of 10. Depending on when experimenters come, during which class, they can come at the time when I'm in one of the 2 honor classes, and then I'm sitting also with students who are like motivated. Or they can come when I myself am sitting in one of the 8 classes that are non-honors classes, and then I myself are equally motivated on average. But in this, I'm sitting with the classmates who are not that motivated. You see the difference. So we're keeping constant the average level of motivation of a person, but compare with the situation where this person is surrounded by highly motivated students or surrounded by not that motivated students. So this is exactly what they did, and the wonderful thing is the results turn out to be exactly the opposite, depending on which group you are. So basically, if I'm sitting here, like, remember, this is subsample of only people who are taking two honor classes, so they're equally motivated themselves. But if I'm sitting in a class with non-motivated students, I want to study, but I want to do it privately. So if I'm taking, there's almost 80% of people who sign up, but if I know that it will be publicly known in the class of unmotivated students, it drops to 54%. So there's a huge difference. People want to conceal the fact that they study hard if they're in non-honors class. And the result is exactly the opposite if they're in an honors class. So if it's private, it's still about 70%, which probably is like a true, how many of them truly want to study hard. But if I'm sitting in an honors class, I want to tell everyone that I study hard, and I'm one of these students that study hard. So if it's a public decision, it goes up to 97%. Almost everyone takes the class. So basically, this is like, you see how important that social pressure. So if you do it privately, like about 72-79% people were really intrinsically, internally motivated to take this course. If I'm sitting in a class of, lazy students, I don't want to show off as, I'm smart, you're stupid, and I'm study hard and you don't. So you just conceal it, and almost 20% of people say they refuse to take a really good online course just not to appear as a smart ass in their class. And exactly so, and 20 the same, I don't know whether the same or not, 20%, they really don't want to take this course themselves. But because they are in class of all these smart and hardworking students, they at least it's not clear whether they're taking this course, but they're saying, at least publicly, that they are willing to take this class, just to show that how smart they are, how hardworking, not smart. Here, hardworking. So this is like really, so that tells you a lot. And I wanted to stress the magnitude. 20, like more than 20% of students change their behavior, another take or don't take a very kind of valuable course that can help them a lot getting admitted to college and getting financial aid. Just depending on the reasoning, whether how I will look in the eyes of my classmates. And they basically forgot, like they reduce their chances of getting to college or increase them under social pressure. So I think what's not really nice about this paper is not only that it clearly documents that the social image played a role, but it shows how important it is. Like more than 20% is enormous. I don't think that, I mean, I've read a lot of literature of people trying to improve a quality of education in developed countries. You can train whatever teachers, provide more textbooks, whatever, introduce online. I've never seen an effect of 20% increase. So the peer pressure in education is enormously important. So the question, like the proper mix of students and mix of students with a similar motivation is extremely important in education. So like all these talks about segregation, whether you want to intermix people or not, they're actually very, very consequential because they affect this peer pressure. And this is especially people, like again, in terms of heterogeneity, it turns out to be that a lot of students know that this about themselves. So before this experiment, they just asked people how important for you being popular in your class. And it turns out to be that, like, just based on self-reported importance of how important is the popularity, that actually plays a huge variation in people who of this effect of public versus private taking of this course. So it turns out to be that even in observational data, so not only in this experiment, you see similar effects. So there was a setting in which there was like again computer-based kind of online system in math and English, also in California. And at some point, like so you could solve the task, and the system will give you a feedback how good you are, and everything was private, everything went well, until for some magic reason this company, without announcing it to students, made it public and said, like, well, they started announcing you are among the 3 top people in your grade, I think, or class. Yeah, that's something. So they thought that they will provide additional motivation for people to study hard because that like will be public how good you are. It turned out to be that it made exactly the opposite, because they were publishing the top 3. So students exactly in the area kind of were at the bottom quintile, so people who were close to be this top 3, they decreased their effort once it became public. So there was a drop here in the number of correct answers per day, because they didn't want everyone to know how hard they study. And that's an interesting point that that at least in this context of like LA, in California, and people who study in this, and for people who just the 3 other quartiles are not very important, interesting, because they're people like they have no chance of being top 3, so they didn't care. They continued working. So the not very nice fact is that on average, if you don't do an experiment, just on average make it public. On average, people are the number of people who for whom the peer pressure pushes them to study, to signal that they study hard, is smaller than the number of people for whom the peer pressure pushes them to conceal the fact that they study hard. So on average, the peer pressure is not to study hard and to whatever, enjoy yourself. Again, hard to generalize to other countries' context, etc. But at least in context of California, peer pressure works against good education, and you have to come up with special features for to allow, for example, to students to study so that nobody else, none of their classmates knows that they're studying. That helps promoting good education, and that is actually this is a very important point that I think we really need to keep in mind, that when we talk about quality of education, all the inputs of teachers, textbooks, whatever, online courses, etc. They obviously they play a huge role, but the social environment, the classmates, and especially just the understanding what classmates think is good or not, whether it's cool to study or it's not so cool to study, plays enormous role in determining educational outcomes. And that can lead to these poverty traps and high inequality in education, is because if you happen to live in a neighborhood or hang out in a company of people who think that studying hard is not cool, you will end up studying not cool, and that will become a new social norm. So a lot of these pockets of bad education, they're not because of insufficient funds or insufficient resources put there. A lot of that is because there are bad social norms that are formed there, and it should be completely different methods of fighting. You can provide them with online courses for free, amazing, good online courses. They will not take them up until you can do it privately and not tell your classmates. And that's a very important point. Okay, then I think it will quite naturally lead to identity things that Rachel will be talking about. But if there are any questions now to this, what I was talking about, I will be more than happy to answer them.
Can I just ask one quick question about this?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking whether it's possible that the low-performing student, they actually lack confidence. So they don't want to embarrass themselves such that they're taking courses and then fails later.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So the next, so the paper I didn't have time to talk about. Okay, this one, the next paper. Also Burston, but Jensen, but also Georgy Igor, is exactly about this. I'm afraid to do it. It's cool. It has a smart name of cool to be smart or smart to be cool. So is it you're not making it public that you study hard because you're afraid to fail, and then if your peers observe that you tried, you took this online course and then you failed, means you're stupid. If they don't observe that you took the course and you fail, you say, well, it's just because I don't care. If I only cared and I took this course, obviously I will be great. So, and there's they try exactly to do this, and there is another experiment that shows that this motivation also plays a role. That sometimes people who are motivated, actually because their classmates are motivated for being smart, trying to be smart, they're afraid to do it public so that others don't think that they're stupid. So and the results in the previous paper that they mix these two different motivations, and you actually can separate them. And then if you separate them, it means that the peer pressure is even higher. But it works for different people, works in different directions. So if you want to study to learn more about this, read this paper by Burston, Yegorov, and Johnson.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so there in the chat, there something about Gather, which is organizational issue. I cannot comment. For me, I tried to join Gather, it didn't work either. So yeah, I share your pain. Okay, thanks. So, well, if Gather is working, then maybe see each other in the lunch period together. If not, then just have a good lunch. Bye. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Okay.